40 days for the signal to reach Athena, and 40 days for the Gurn cruiser to reach Ragnarok. In 100 days, the Gurns would be there. The men who would engage in the fight for the cruiser quit trimming their beards. Later, when it was time for the Gurns to appear, they would discard their woolen garments for ones of goatskin. The Gurns would regard them as primitive inferiors at best, and it might be of advantage to heighten the impression. It would make the awakening of the Gurns a little more shocking. An underground passage, leading from the town to the concealment of the woods in the distance, had long ago been dug. Through it the women and children would go when the Gurns arrived. There was a level area of ground, just beyond the south wall of town, where the cruiser would be almost certain to land. The town had been built with that thought in mind. Woods were not far from both sides of the landing site, and unicorn corrals were hidden in them. From the corrals would come the rear flanking attack against the Gurns. The prowlers, of course, would be scattered among all the forces. The generator was completed and installed on the 19th night. Charlie Craig, a giant of a man whose red beard gave him a genially murderous appearance, opened the valve of the water pipe. The new wooden turbine stirred, and belts and pulleys began to spin. The generator hummed, the needles of the dials climbed, flickered, and steadied. Norman Lake looked from them to Humboldt, his pale gray eyes coldly satisfied. "Full output," he said. "We have the power we need this time." Jim Chiara was at the transmitter, and they waited while he threw switches and studied dials. Every component of the transmitter had been tested, but they had not had the power to test the complete assembly. "That's it," he said at last, looking up at them. "She's ready, after almost 200 years of wanting her." Humboldt wondered what the signal should be, and saw no reason why it should not be the same one that had been sent out with such hope 165 years ago. "All right, Jim," he said. "Let the Gurns know we're waiting for them. Make it Ragnarok calling again." The transmitter key rattled, and the all-wave signal that the Gurns could not fail to receive went out at a velocity of 5 light-years a day. "Ragnarok calling, Ragnarok calling, Ragnarok calling." It was the longest summer Humboldt had ever experienced. He was not alone in his impatience. Among all of them, the restlessness flamed higher as the slow days dragged by, making it almost impossible to go about their routine duties. The gentle mockers sensed the anticipation of their masters for the coming battle, and they became nervous and apprehensive. The prowlers sensed it, and they paced about the town in the dark of night, watching, listening, on ceaseless guard against the mysterious enemy their masters waited for. Even the unicorns seemed to sense what was coming, and they rumbled and squealed in their corrals at night, red-eyed with the lust for blood, and sometimes attacking the log walls with blows that shook the ground. The interminable days went their slow succession, and summer gave way to fall. The 100th day dawned, cold and gray with the approach of winter, the day of the Gurns. But no cruiser came that day, nor the next. He stood again on the stockade wall in the evening of the 3rd day, Fenrir and Seguin beside him. He listened for the first dim, distant sound of the Gurn cruiser, and heard only the moaning of the wind around him. Winter was coming. Always on Ragnarok, winter was coming, or the brown death of summer. Ragnarok was a harsh and barren prison, and no amount of desire could ever make it otherwise. Only the coming of a Gurn cruiser could ever offer them the bloody, violent opportunity to regain their freedom. But what if the cruiser never came? It was a thought too dark and hopeless to be held. They were not asking a large favor of fate, after 200 years of striving for it, only the chance to challenge the Gurn Empire with bows and knives. Fenrir stiffened, the fur lifting on his shoulders and a muted growl coming from him. Then Humboldt heard the first whisper of sound, a faint, faraway roaring that was not the wind. He watched and listened, and the sound came swiftly nearer, rising in pitch and swelling in volume. Then it broke through the clouds, tall and black and beautifully deadly. It rode down on its rockets of flame, filling the valley with its thunder, and his heart hammered with exultation. It had come! The cruiser had come! He turned and dropped the 10 feet to the ground inside the stockade. The warning signal was being sounded from the center of town, a unicorn horn that gave out the call they had used in the practice alarms. Already the women and children would be hurrying along the tunnels that led to the temporary safety of the woods beyond the town. The Gurns might use their turret blasters to destroy the town and all in it before the night was over. There was no way of knowing what might happen before it ended. But whatever it was, it would be the action they had all been wanting. He ran to where the others would be gathering, Fenrir and Seguin loping beside him, and the horn ringing wild and savage and triumphant as it was announced the end of 2 centuries of waiting. The cruiser settled to Earth in the area where it had been expected to land, towering high above the town with its turret blasters looking down upon the houses. Charlie Craig and Norman Lake were waiting for him on the high steps of his own house in the center of town, where the elevation gave them a good view of the ship, yet where the fringes of the canopy would conceal them from the ship's scanners. They were heavily armed, their prowlers beside them and their mockers on their shoulders. Elsewhere, under the connected rows of concealing canopies, armed men were hurrying to their prearranged stations. Most of them were accompanied by prowlers, bristling and snarling as they looked at the alien ship. A few men were deliberately making themselves visible not far away, going about unimportant tasks with only occasional and carefully disinterested glances toward the ship. They were the bait to lure the first detachment into the center of town. "Well?" Norman Lake asked, his pale eyes restless with his hunger for violence. "There's our ship. When do we take her?" "Just as soon as we get them outside it," he said. "We'll use the plan we first had. Wait until they send a full force to rescue the first detachment, and then we hit them with everything we have." His black, white-nosed mocker was standing in the open doorway and watching the hurrying men and prowlers with worried interest. Tip, the great-great-great-grandson of the mocker that had died with Howard Lake north of the plateau. He reached down to pick him up and set him on his shoulder, and said, "Jim?" "The longbows are ready," Tip's treble imitation of Jim Chiara's voice answered. "We'll black out their searchlights when the time comes." "Andy?" he asked. "The last of us for this section are coming in now," Andy Taylor answered. He made his check of all the sub-leaders, then looked up to the roof to ask, "All set, Jimmy?" Jimmy Stevens' grinning face appeared over the edge. 10 crossbows are cocked and waiting up here. Bring us our targets." They waited, while the evening deepened into near dusk. Then the airlock of the cruiser slid open, and 13 Gurns emerged, the one leading them wearing the resplendent uniform of a sub-commander. "There they come," he said to Lake and Craig. "It looks like we'll be able to trap them in here and force the commander to send out a full-sized force. We'll all attack at the sound of the horn, and if you can hit their rear flanks hard enough with the unicorns to give us a chance to split them from this end, some of us should make it to the ship before they realize up in the control room that they should close the airlocks. Now," he looked at the Gurns who were coming straight toward the stockade wall, ignoring the gate to their right, "you'd better be on your way. We'll meet again before long in the ship." Fenrir and Seguin looked from the advancing Gurns to him with question in their eyes after Lake and Craig were gone, Fenrir growling restlessly. "Pretty soon," he said to them. "Right now, it would be better if they didn't see you. Wait inside, both of you." They went reluctantly inside to merge with the darkness of the interior. Only an occasional yellow gleam of their eyes showed that they were crouched to spring just